You are now listening to EdYOUcate, the most fired up educational podcast there is. EdYOUcate is all about the quality education access to students and how we can provide research-based solutions to free the young minds of the world. On this podcast, we will be exploring different educational experiences, education's greatest of debates, and more. The hottest educational podcast out. EdYOUcate is brought to you from the Albany State University's very own Center for Educational Opportunity. Enjoy.
Today, we will have Paula and Penn-Nabrit. We're going to be discussing the topic of homeschooling as an educational option. So, Paula, do you mind telling the listeners a little bit about yourself and why this topic is so important to you?
Certainly, and thank you very much for having me as a guest. I'm very excited to participate. This is my first podcast, so that's very exciting. So my background, my introduction, and I'll try to do the quick 3-minute version. So I'll be 67 on my next birthday. So been around the sun a few times. And I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, but I did my undergraduate work at Wellesley College. And so I grew up in a lower middle class Black neighborhood. But in 1968, my parents enrolled me at independent day school in Columbus School for Girls. And I was the only Black kid in my class the whole 4 years that I was there. So that was a really interesting kind of an experience at an interesting time. So 1968 was a very intense sort of time on lots of levels. And so that was the space in which I went to prep school. So I'd gone from a large urban public high school, junior high school, and elementary school into a very small, exclusive, independent day school. So it was not a religious school. It was a true private, read that, expensive, exclusive white school. So when I graduated, there were only 28 of us in our graduating class. It was that kind of a school. Uniforms, blazers, no electives. Everybody takes Latin. You don't pick. We tell you what you're taking. Everybody. I went from there to Wellesley, and that's where I did my undergraduate work. And I had a double major in philosophy and political science. I thought I was going to be a big-time thinker, but I met this really cute brother from Dartmouth. And a little fun fact, his family originally was from Albany, Georgia. But my late father-in-law referred to it as Albany. So it was a while before I knew that was Albany. And so Charles Nabrit is who I met from Dartmouth. And being from the Midwest, and my mother didn't go to college at all. My mother worked for the federal government. My father worked for Western Electric, but my father had gone to Ohio State on the GI Bill. Both my mother and my father's parents were from Ohio. So I didn't really have much contact with people from the South and very little contact with HBCUs. So I didn't know that the Nabrits were a very, very, very significant family. I had no idea. I just thought he was a cute brother who was really sweet. So I graduated, we got married. I took a year off, then I went to law school at Ohio State. We moved to Columbus. And in law school, I thought I was going to be a big time securities attorney. But we had a set of twins in law school instead. So when the twins were 13 months old, I graduated from law school. And I had nursed them while I was in law school and was starting to buy baby food. And Charles said, we don't know who bottled that. We have to grow our own food. And I was like, you're such a freak. Because I don't know, hair flip, who you think has time to do that? And he said, gardening is like parenting and pasturing. They all require the same daily attention to detail, same posture of humility, head bowed, body bent. People who don't have time to garden probably don't have time to parent. Okay. Paradigm shift. So that's how I began gardening. And then a year later, so when the twins were 2, we had our third son. So we have three sons. We then both took jobs with AT&T on the divestiture project. So for those of you who are not old farts, you may not know that there was once just one phone company in the United States, AT&T. And so when AT&T was divested through the Justice Department's ruling, my job was the review and approval of the legal requirements for the split and distribution of all AT&T stock into the 7 regional holding companies. So I'd had this kind of, and after about 3 years, I realized I loved the work. I was good at the work. I did not like having a boss who could actually boss me around. So I left in 1986 and started my own business, Penn-Nabrit and Associates, P&A Inc. We do demographic research and statistical analysis. And our largest, most consistent client, certainly over the last 20 years, has been the U.S. Department of Energy. So it's a bona fide business. It's not a side hustle. Okay, it's a business. And in that context, we decided to start the business as a home-based business, as a business model to control expenses. Once we were about 4 years in, so we started the business in 86. In 1991, we finally decided we were going to homeschool our kids. And so we came into homeschooling very much through a back door. We were not, I always admire when I meet younger parents who say, I knew when I found out I had conceived, I knew I was going to homeschool. I'm like, wow. Or I knew before my kids went to preschool, I was going to homeschool. I can't lie and say we had that insight, Jamila. We did not. We ended up in homeschooling by default. So our kids had done public school when we lived in Jacksonville, Florida. They did private school when we moved back to Columbus. They went to the boys' school of the girls' school that I went to. But ultimately, what we realized that we could not afford private school, financially or psychologically, because the same kinds of issues that my parents had dealt with in 1968, we were still addressing those same issues with our own children. And my husband's position was, sweetie pie, we have at least, if not significantly better credentials than anyone who's teaching our children. My husband was brilliant. He whizzed through Dartmouth in 3 years, graduated with honors and a box of varsity letters. A total freak, and came from a family of freakish overachievers, right? So my husband's grandfather was at Morehouse in 1898. And his grandfather's mother, was in the first class of Spelman in 1881. She was already married and had a child, and when emancipation happened, the first thing she did was enroll. And similarly, my maternal great-grandmother was at Bluefield State Teachers College in 1898. So we are both from families that have been in this country since the late 1700s. We are both from families that have been pursuing lifelong marriages and post-secondary education for as long as it's been legally possible for Black people to do so. So the idea that some other people or institutional structure would be better equipped to educate our children and prepare them for life in these United States, yeah, not really. So that's kind of the long introduction and explanation as to how we ventured into homeschooling.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for that. I like how your homeschooling journey or experience is very unique. And you've mentioned how you and your husband were talking about gardening. And so I just wanted to ask, how does homeschooling help holistic health and just overall health of your children?
I think that's one of the things that I sometimes find most difficult to convey to people. So I really appreciate you asking that early on in the conversation. I think that part of the piece that's missing when we look at how is it that, what's the secret sauce that helps children emerge into the world as high functioning adults? And I think that secret sauce is holistic health. I think that we often see ourselves in society in ways that are super alienating. So we are either, you see people who are either super duper into church, which I understand because I'm fourth generation apostolic Pentecostal, earrings notwithstanding. So I really know that experience of everything you do is in church because nothing else matters. We're in the world, but not of it, right? And then there are also people who are super into their academics. That's their whole life. And again, I know that. I've had that experience of going to high-powered prep schools and colleges and law school, and I get that. Some people are super into sports and that whole athletic thing and what they eat, and it can't be gluten, and I'm only vegan, and it's got to be distilled water. If I can fit it in my mouth, I'll eat it. But I get Seriously. I mean, if it can be cut and put, yeah, I'll eat that. Some people are super into their intellectual space, right? They read, they live the life of the mind. That's their whole thing. I think that each of those pieces are viable and significant, but none of them alone is sufficient for vibrant, healthy life. I think we need to, both in ourselves as adults and certainly in the nurturing of our children, be super intentional about this oneness. Now, I'll admit the oneness idea of holistic health resonates because, again, I grew up in an apostolic Pentecostal church. So the idea of the oneness of the Godhead, right? That there is one God that exists as the Father, as the Son, and the Holy Ghost, but he's one person. His name is Jesus. So that oneness idea works for me. Similarly, the idea of then recognizing that my children are spiritual, intellectual, and physical beings all at once, and that all of those parts of them have to be recognized and validated and nurtured. And homeschooling is, I'm not going to say it's the only way that can happen, but it's the easiest way for that to happen because you're not dealing with external forces, right? We were not combating, when our kids came home from school, then you're sort of re-indoctrinating them, right? And I think a lot of that's the second thing about homeschooling, at least the way we did it, that I know people struggle with is I'm a big proponent of indoctrination. There are a lot of people who do child-led learning, and I have seen that work. So I'm not critiquing that. I'm just saying that as my first book, as for me and my house, it was a total command and control kind of a thing. Based on that, my husband's position was, we know what is out there. And we know, it's like no matter how bright you are, no matter how well trained you are, if you decide to go to Tibet or someplace and you're gonna scale the Himalayas, you get a Sherpa, right? Because I don't care how good your equipment is, I don't care how long you've trained, you don't know the terrain. That's why you hire a Sherpa. And they can tell you, see that crevice right there? See that body? Because if you fall in one, they're not taking you down the mountain. You just, you can see, oh, look, see there? So my husband very much felt like our job was to be Sherpas for our sons, to tell them, here's a crevice, here's a crevice. Gardening really helps with that because one of the things that is very clear in gardens, and it's very much biblical, like one of our hashtags we have a large community garden, a memorial garden. It's 5,000 square feet. And one of our hashtags is, he started us in a garden for a reason. It's fascinating to me how many Black churches have food pantries and food giveaways and well-manicured lawns, and very few of them have gardens. He did not start the human family in a church, a tabernacle, or a tent. He started the human family in a garden, and everything else in Genesis that he spoke, right? He said, let there be light, and there was light. Let there be separation of the firmament, and it happened. But when it came to the creation of the living space for the human family, he planted a garden. So this work component is really critical. And then the other thing is, which even people in the world say, things like, for everything there is a season. And yeah, the Beatles did a great song about that. You're probably too young to remember it. It's not about the Beatles, but yeah, they were, and they had this song. And it's true, for everything there is a season. And it's one thing to know that, but in a garden, a child sees that. They experience that. They see what it is to plant. They see what germination looks like. So that's an easy introduction to conflict, right? Because every seed bursts its container. If everything remains smooth at the surface level, growth is not occurring. When growth occurs, there is a splitting apart. And then the child can see the germination, they see the conflict, they see the growth. They see the importance of watching It doesn't matter how good the soil is. And if you have, so you can have organic soil and you can have open pollinated seed, non-GMO. But if you are not watching, that garden space will be overrun by weeds, right? And so that whole idea about the way that you parent is the way that you garden. You can't just walk around and say, it's all looks good. You need to get head bowed, body bent. You need to be down at the root system, and then you see, look at that weed, and how often the weeds mimic the shade and coloring of the actual plant. So if you're not watching carefully, you will be overwhelmed and you won't even realize it until it's late. That's why, again, that whole biblical thing about God's going to separate the wheat from the tares, because everybody up next to you, which is another great lesson for children to learn in a garden. Everybody who's up next to you, like right here with you, is not your friend. Some of those people are like the weeds sucking nutrients from your soul. It's like when you're growing tomatoes and you have all the extra foliage. Those are suckers. Literally, that's what we call them. Those are suckers. They are sucking the life out of the plant, right? And so gardening is a really easy way. I remember once listening to Charles talk to our boys, and I know I don't even think they were in kindergarten yet. And he was explaining to them the difference between annuals and perennials, right? So, annuals are those plants that come up each year and then they die and they're done. And perennials are the things that come back year after year after year. And he said, you're going to make mistakes in your life because everybody does. Try to keep your mistakes in the annual category, not in the perennials. Go slow, okay? Don't plant a whole lot of mint because you might not like it. Don't plant a whole lot of zucchini. It's not a perennial, but it takes over, right? It'll produce a lot. Wait, just kind of slow your roll as you meet new people. Just watch. Watch as well as pray. And that's an easy thing. And I remember hearing him talk to them about that. And at the end of that season, I remember them saying, we did have too much zucchini. We don't like it that much. And so gardens give children a space to sort of learn life lessons. One of the things that I've even said with some of the teenagers who volunteer at our garden, I use the asparagus as a teaching tool, the asparagus and the peas. The asparagus is a good lesson about how things are not what they seem to be. So I don't know if have you ever seen asparagus growing?
No.
So when you first plant it, it looks perfect. It's just teeny tiny. It's like human children when they're like toddlers. You know how they're so cute, you can't stand it. You're like, you're so cute. I can hardly, like my heart's just bursting. You're so cute. And then they become teenagers and they go through that stinky phase. And you're like, That's why you should take lots and lots of pictures when they're toddlers between ages of 2 and 5, plaster them all over your house so you can remind yourself, I love this person. I love this person. Don't kill them, make it look like an accident. Because if you wait, so the first time we planted asparagus, I had never seen asparagus growing. It started off perfect. I had to go on a business trip. We came back and it looked like pernicious weed. And I was about to just pull it all up. And Charles said, Sweetie Pie, do you know what asparagus looks like when it's growing or just when it's done? In fact, it takes 4 years to get a harvest from asparagus. And during that 4 years, each fall, it turns into what looks like pernicious weed. I mean, literally, it'll start off like about, 6 inches tall, and then you'll come back and it's 3 feet tall. And it doesn't look anything like asparagus. It just looks like weed. But if you just keep weeding it and watering it, in 4 years, you will have the most delicious asparagus that you've ever had. And it's a perennial, which means it'll come back for 20 years. If you just wait and nurture it and let it take root, just like your children, right? You have to give it time to take root. Similarly with peas, that's another great life lesson in the garden. Peas will grow almost on concrete. You can throw pea seed anywhere and you'll get peas. But what I always tell young parents is, and teenagers, put the support in before you plant the seed, okay? Because you can get a lot of harvest, but it'll be messy and dirty and subject to disease and infestation because it's in the dirt. If you put the support in first, the pea plant will attach itself to the support. Now you'll get a few crazy ones, right? But you just gently put it back, right? And then you'll have a beautiful, bountiful harvest. You'll reduce the exposure to disease and fungus that's in the soil. But you need to put the structure in first, right? So it's like with math. You know how the order of operation matters? You can do all the right calculations. Like, it took me a long time to figure that out. That factoring thing is for real.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And even with just how you can relate gardening to just different things in life, like lifelong lessons for your children. I think that's so important, how everything that you just stated related back to things that you learn in an actual public or private institution, but they're learning these things while they're at home. And
Yes.
so I just wanted to ask, how does homeschooling transcend the, I guess, so-called achievement gap, or what is your viewpoint on the achievement gap?
Okay. I just have to say, for anyone who knows me and heard that question, I have to say this was not a plant. I did not ask you to ask, because this is a thing for me. And in fact, I wrote a paper on how homeschooling addresses the so-called achievement gap. Because I use that term so-called on purpose to cast aspersion. The issue that I have with the term achievement gap is that it centers, when we talk about in literature, the white gaze, when we talk about the achievement gap, we are centering whiteness and sometimes Asianness as the norm. And so when we see Black children who are not matching those performance metrics, we don't say what's wrong with the performance metrics, how the metrics are achieved, how they are accrued, who determines what they are. We look at the end, not the process. And so part of what I encourage people to think about differently is, if we think about education as a process, right, which I think a lot of us don't. I think a lot of people on both ends of the argument come to the conversation about education with a level of emotional energy that I think is counterproductive. So whether that's the problem is that Black children are coming out of communities where people aren't serious about education, right? So we've all heard that argument. A lot of people don't care about education of their kids, and they won't make their kids study. They'll go and take their kid to football camp. They'll take their daughter and have her spend 8 hours getting her hair braided, but they won't spend the time or the money for a math tutor, right? So there's that whole mythology. And then the other end is this conspiracy to destroy Black people. Like that's why it's happening, because people are sitting at home like, now tomorrow when I go into the classroom, I need to make sure that I mess up all these Black kids. Both of those kinds of mythologies have their own energy, which is why they are so persistent. But neither of them help us move to a point of resolution. It just keeps us in the conversation. I think conversely, if we approach education as a process, then we can look at other kinds of process-based concepts and see how they work. Now, that might be more obvious to me because, again, in my real life, what we do is demographic research and statistical analysis. So we work with organizations that are focused on process improvement. So not just like with the Department of Energy. The work that we did with Toyota of North America was based around continuous process improvement. So if we brought that thinking into education, if we were building cars and the fourth wheel on all the blue cars was missing, we wouldn't say, oh, the blue cars aren't serious about transportation. The blue cars didn't manufacture themselves. And we also wouldn't say the people working on the assembly line are getting together and conspiring to make sure that none of the blue cars have the fourth wheel. We would instead go back to the manufacturing process and say, where are we missing a step in there is a defect in the process, right? There's a defect in the process. And so when we bring that to education in the context of the achievement gap, what we've looked at is there is a misstep in the process. And so part of the research that's in this paper focuses on preschool. We go from preschool all the way through the conclusion of master's degree programs. And we look at data points. And when you begin looking at the data points, you can see where the process fails. So right off the bat, one of the things that we looked at in the process is the fact that despite this mythology that Black people don't care about education, statistically, more Black parents have their children enrolled in preschools than white families. Black families are disproportionately represented in these early academic intervention kinds of programs. But the other thing that became clear was that a lot of Black parents presume that that is a value neutral position and that all the academic work that needs to happen in the life of a 3-year-old is happening during those hours that they're at preschool. Both of those are invalid assumptions. The process is not value neutral because education is an extension of societal norms. So education from the beginning to the end is based on the premise that everyone is coming into this capitalist structure to play a certain role. Some people's roles are producers, some people's roles are consumers. Some people's roles are workers, some people's roles are owners. That's what education does in a capitalist utilitarian society, is it prepares people to take their place. So if you're satisfied with the place that you have, then, by all means, put your kids in that program and they too will have their space assigned to them. But if you are not contented with that, then you have to rethink this, right? You have to rethink this. So part of what we recognize is, again, if we're just looking at the numbers, statistically, African-American male children are at the bottom of all performance metrics other than athletics. And that statistic holds true whether those children are in 2-parent households, whether they are in a single-parent household, whether their parents have completed college or they have dropped out of high school, whether they are in an urban, suburban, or rural school district. That's how you know that can't be coincidental. Right? That's an institutionalized norm. And because it's an institutionalized norm, the people who are participating in it don't even recognize that they are perpetuating the status quo, which is why when we began homeschooling, we did not select tutors from the College of Education. We selected tutors in that specific discipline. So for mathematics, we went to the College of Mathematics and hired tutors. For French, we went to the French department and hired tutors. For biology, we went to the biology department and hired tutors. We were not interested in hiring people who were being trained to be educators. We were interested in people who were trained in that particular discipline because there is a difference, right? There is a difference. And so when you then also factor in, again, focusing on African-American male children, because that's what my spawn are, right? Our children are boys. So that was the data group that I'm most interested in. That was the demographic group. The fact that over 70% of classroom teachers in grades K through 12 are Caucasian white women is in and of itself problematic. And we know that because even if we look outside of the racial impact. So for example, when I say I went to an all-girls high school, there's a reason why historically the wealthiest families with the greatest degree of influence and control over the trajectory of their own spawn had their children, and particularly their female children, in single-sex education and single-sex colleges. It's not surprising that, for example, Wellesley has a higher graduation rate, even for Black students, than any other school in the country. It's a school that's made for women. Okay, we didn't make a space for you, right? I went to a prep school that was designed for girls. They didn't make a space for girls. Everything in the school revolved around female students. And I thought, now, if rich white people know that patriarchy is such a dominant thematic that they separate their own wives, daughters from that space as long as possible, what might we extrapolate for Black people? So, yeah, we wanted to create a parallel universe in which, because again, part of what we don't look at with this achievement gap is how much intellectual energy do Black children have to expend trying to decode what is happening day in and day out. How much energy does it take for a child to try to understand, what does that mean? Why did she say that? Why is she acting like that? And if we think that children don't perceive these kinds of biases, we're kidding ourselves. Because if you've ever had any kind of a mammal as a pet, you know that your dog may not walk up to you and say, you know what, this sounds crazy, but I have a bad feeling about that person. But mammals sense things, right? If you've ever had a cat, the cat doesn't come up and say, you know what, I don't know. The cat just arches its back and its hair stands up. The cat knows. The cat knows. Mammals sense, like they can tell when there's about to be a storm, right? They are attuned to things. We have that same capacity to be attuned. That's why, again, the word says watch as well as pray. We don't, Jesus doesn't need geniuses, right? But he does say, if any man lack wisdom, let him ask. Show me what is happening here. Because a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 20-year-old often cannot perceive what is really happening, but they're expending energy trying to decode that. So it's very much similar to when we do workshops on safety culture, for example. Part of what we talk about is the correlation between civility and excellence and safety. Because when accidents happen, at least in the kind of firms that we work with, this is not like a fast food restaurant where you come in at 10 o'clock, fill out some paperwork, and start working that afternoon. The organizations that we work with, if you get hired there, you've been vetted multiple times, okay? So there's no question about core competencies. You know how to do this work. When accidents happen, it's because people are distracted. And there are few things more distracting than having somebody talk to you crazy, right? When people come out their pocket, when they raise their voice, and it's even worse when people are nasty, nice, nasty. So there's no cursing, no one's raised their voice, but the level of contempt is palpable. And that's distracting for adults. If we think that our children are in school all day, every day, and are not picking up on these cues, and they don't even always have the language to tell us what's happening. And so when we talk about the achievement gap, a lot of the challenge is long before the first question on the first standardized test is asked, the child is already disadvantaged because of the space. So they are not coming in with the sense of, everyone here thinks you're brilliant. We expect you to blow this test up. Oh my God, you're so smart. Our children are not getting that. Now, my children got that because their daddy thought they were geniuses and told everybody all the time. It was very embarrassing. But certainly once we began homeschooling, because we hand selected the tutors and we only hired Black, African or African Americans. Of the 9 tutors that we hired, 7 were men, 2 were sisters. Now, a lot of people have given us that pushback about, girl, I don't have that kind of money. Excuse me. And people use the money as an excuse. But, to quote Dr. King, we pay for what we want and beg for what we need. So when people tell me how they can't afford it, and then I look at that and they got a smartphone that connects to Mars, when they got multiple cars with $400, $500, $600 a month car payments, when they get their nails done on the people that I've never seen their real, like, do you have real nails? Do you have real hair? Do you have real eyelashes? Because it stays tight. It stays tight. And what I know is all that costs money. Now, when we were homeschooling our children, because again, we've always been self-employed, we had one car and it was a hoopty. My husband was really good at fixing things. Once he bought a car that was $200. Crossed my heart, hope to die. I was like, Charles, really? He's like, sweetie pie, I can make this work. I can make this work. Yes. One car. Charles cut everybody's hair, his, mine, and all of our children. We ate at home, and at least 50% of the food we consumed, we grew in our own garden. We did not have cable. Now, granted, when we dropped Evan, our last one off at college, we were calling the cable people on our way home. But we did not have cable while our children were being homeschooled. There was no cable. There were no video games. We did not eat out. Nobody was buying any expensive tennis shoes, as Charles told them, when you get that first NBA contract. But for now, no. Okay, that's a hard no. And so when people tell me about, oh, I can't afford oceanography camp, I can't afford space camp, I can't afford engineering camp, I can't afford a tutor, but you can afford to eat out on the regular. And how do I know that? Because you're posting it all the time. Here's me at the restaurant. How can you? So the cell phones, the eating out, the stylish clothes, the trips to the beauty shop, the nail shop, people going to the movies and not even at the matinee, going at the expensive time and buying popcorn, $15 for popcorn. What are you doing? And so what I say to people is miss me with what you can't afford. Because what it is that you don't value your child's holistic health and education enough to pay for it. And just be grown. Just be grown on the front end, be grown on the back end. Just say, you know what, that whole thing, but I need some me time. Really? Me time is before you get married and have kids. And then after that last kid leaves home. That's why you don't have to be sad. I wasn't sad when my last child left. We left Evan, and Amber, the dean said, so how do you know Evan? I was like, I'm his mother. She said, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize, because usually, there's a lot of emotional energy. I said, you know what? Evan was homeschooled for 9 years. That anxious look that you see between all these other parents and their kids, like, do you know? Did we say? Do you understand? We have nothing left to say. We could have just slowed the car down, rolled down the window, just tossed them out. Everything that could be said has been said multiple times. I don't have to say, I wonder where the time went. I know where the time went every minute. And it was not pretty. It was not pretty. We were not a happy homeschool family. Our children, Jamila, our children hated being homeschooled. And they told us every day. We didn't have to wonder how they feel about this. They told us. But one of the things that I really admired about their father, and when people say, how did you get this done? Because being admitted to Princeton is not a small accomplishment. And it's not something that someone can do for you. And you cannot make a child read. You cannot make a child write an essay. You cannot make a child do any of this stuff. You can present the ideas, but ultimately, anyone who's ever had a 2-year-old and you try to make them eat something they don't want to, you realize right then you can't make anybody do anything. But Charles, back to your point about holistic health, a fundamental aspect of holistic health is respect. Charles really used the 23rd Psalm as a parenting guide, which is why he did not believe in spanking children. He was like, there'll be no domestic violence in my home. And I was like, isn't that why we have kids? So you have somebody to hit? You've had a bad day. So yeah, there's no hitting. There's no hitting. Not only is there no hitting, but have you ever seen people who talk to their children in ways that are blood curdling? You would never speak to another person on the planet. The way you speak to a child, Charles was not about that. And so every day when they would be like, we hate this, you and mom aren't qualified, when they go back to school. And he would never I was like, I'm old school. I was like, don't ask me about this again. He was always like, come, let us reason together. Tell me your thoughts, tell me your feelings, tell me your opinions. And he would listen. Now, he frequently responded with the standard line, which is, let me explain the beauty of a capitalist democracy to you. The beauty of a capitalist democracy lies in its simplicity. When you don't own anything, you don't run anything. Your mother and I own the means of production. Ergo, we and we alone make all policies. Policies about no cable, policies about no video games, policy about school goes 12 months because grown men do not get 3 months off to sit around and eat pizza and play video games. We make all policies. When said policies become onerous or egregious, you should terminate your dependent status. Now, I was like, they're 11. They can't really terminate their dependent status. But his respectful engagement with them, like, this is how life IS is. This is how life IS is. And this may, in fact, you may get to be 40 years old and decide that was a mistake. But what you won't be able to say is, my parents didn't think about what they were doing. My parents were just going through the motions. I am committed to doing everything I can to assure that you have some choices in your adult life. What I don't want is for you to get to be 30 and say, I really wanted to do X, but I didn't have the background. I really wanted to go to school, but I wasn't prepared. I really wanted to have a skill, but I don't know how to work. So it was a controlled mechanism, but I do think it links to the achievement gap because it goes directly to how we see our children and how our children then see themselves. They see themselves through the eyes of the adults with whom they are engaged. And so that's why it's not surprising that we see that Caucasian white children and Asian children have such high performance metrics. Some of it is that, again, they are much more likely to be engaged in extracurricular enrichment programs. So when my kids would go to things like oceanography camp, space camp, engineering camp, you know what you didn't see? A whole lot of Black people. And yeah, that stuff matters. When my kids were doing ballet mat and opera Columbus, you didn't see a lot of Black. And yes, those things matter. And none of my children are professional musicians. None of them are marine biologists. None of them dance with any professional ballet companies. None of them sing with any opera companies. But that kind of exposure coupled with, and this goes back to the thing about holistic health, my children grew up in an apostolic Pentecostal holiness church. They are fifth generation. They're fifth generation. So like when people would say to me, I just don't understand why you sent them to Princeton because, why didn't you send them to a Black school? Why don't you go to a Black church? Huh? And miss me with there's like, this is the only way to be authentically Black and you all up in that Greek life. You thought I wouldn't tell you? Because my husband was like, there will be no Jack and Jill. There's going to be no links. It's not going to be no fraternities. It's not going to be no sororities. We're not doing that. We're not doing that. And so this apostolic, as my kids would say, blackety black church, this congregation was founded 110 years ago by descendants of formerly enslaved Africans. And they are shocking. It's a shockingly healthy congregation. My mother is going to be 91 in September, Jamila, and she teaches the same Sunday school class she joined when she was 14. Yeah, girl, we don't even announce birthdays unless you're 90 because otherwise we wouldn't be doing nothing else on Sunday.
Wow.
Yeah. So that piece, and again, that links to this whole, that's a demographic of people who grew up gardening and who know how to cook food. We have a farmer's market every week. We sell the produce that we grow for $1 a pound. And I frequently have people say, I don't know how to cook this. My grandmama used to cook that. I don't know how to cook this. I don't know how to cook. And I don't mean something exotic like Swiss chard. I mean collards, kale, turnips. And so all of these pieces go together, helping our children see themselves intellectually, spiritually, And physically, all my kids did sports. They didn't always like it, but they all did sports. And Charles had them do it through Columbus Parks and Rec Centers, which I was not in favor of because, parks and rec centers are always in rough neighborhoods. And, I'm all about the revolution in theory. That does not mean I want my children up in that. But our children grew up going to Columbus Parks and Recs for everything. Basketball, football, everything. And they are better men for it. I didn't see that at the time, but they are better men for that. So I think that the holistic health is the secret sauce for transcending the achievement gap, because we then center that Black child, not how they compare to white children or Asian children.
As we wrap this podcast session up, I do just want to thank you for all of your value-added statements about homeschooling and just the topic about homeschooling as an education option. You've definitely given us a lot of just information and a lot of details about how homeschooling has helped holistically the whole child and the whole being, inwardly, outwardly. And I just want to say thank you for your time. We are going to wrap this session up. And I hope all of you listeners out there really gain some more information about homeschooling and just the background things about homeschooling that we don't really consider.
You have just completed the most recent episode of the EdYOUcate podcast. Thank you for listening to the most fired up educational podcast out. Tune in every first Wednesday of each month at 5 p.m. during the 2021 through 2022